Hello, good morning to all of you. In this first webinar, I hope that you can all hear us well. If that's not the case, I would thank you to let us know through the chat that you have to the right side of your screens, whether privately or not. It would be very important that you could tell us about the voice or any other difficulties that you might have at any time. And I am going to tell you that today we are broadcasting from Buenos Aires and from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia.
The former Undersecretary of the Office of the Chief of Cabinet and Mr. Castillo, the advisor to the National Legislative Branch, who has taken part and is kind enough to be helping us here. She's going to be making comments here today with us about her experience with regard to horizontal accountability mechanisms, particularly in Argentina. First of all, very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about us. As Andrés was saying, he's the director of a public policy consultancy. He was the Undersecretary of Public Management and Public Employment at the Office of the Chief of Cabinet in Argentina, and he's also had a number of positions within that office. He has a degree in political science from the University of Buenos Aires and in Argentina, and a master's in public administration and public policy from the University of San Andrés. He's also done postgraduate studies in Portugal. Agustin Soy is the coordinator of policy influence. She's also a consultant for the World Bank and the IDB. She's got a degree in public policy. We also have with us Sofia Esteves. She was with us last week to help us make the presentation. She's an analyst at our program here at CIPPEC, and she's studied political science at San Andrés University in Buenos Aires, and she's just finishing her master's in public policy. Ursula Lacuna is also going to be with us. She's from Ethiopia. We'll also have with us Dr. Haman Musahara, who's our counterpart in this project. I'm Natalia Aquilino, and I'm the director of the CIPPEC think tank. I have an MA in Labor Social Sciences from Buenos Aires universities, and I've worked at a number of Argentine universities, and I've also worked for the UN, and at the moment I'm working here in CIPPEC. To start with, then, I'd like to ask Sofia, please, to let us know how we can work together and what the dynamic is going to be during the following hour and a half. So I will let Sofia speak. Well, we're going to be speaking in Spanish and English. And you can choose the option down at the bottom of the page, and on the right, under the video, there you can enter in the chat, you can make your comments and send questions. Depending on what you want to do, then you can choose the right option and ask your questions, make your comments in the chat area. If you have a question in another language, you can click on the translation button. And if you want to have a private chat with the moderator or any other participants, you can click on their name and start to chat individually. And the aim of this webinar is going to be analyzing the existence and the extent of implementation gap in horizontal accountability in the executive. That's to say, if there's a gap between what the law says as an ideal and practice, and if so, we have to have a look at the causes. and the different factors which could be affecting the development of these institutions. We want to have a look at the policies that help us to address these gaps and improve the mechanisms of horizontal accountability in Latin America. Thank you, Sophia. We could take a second for comments or questions before starting the webinar. So if anyone has any questions or comments. Okay, then we can start with the substance content. Thank you. Okay, to start working on horizontal accountability, in this case, we're going to have this theme today. And as a definition that we're working on is one that we like a lot for a great many reasons, but basically because what this definition does is to share the responsibility of accountability by those who provide and those who receive information subject to analysis. This definition helps us to understand accountability with two fundamental aspects. One, the act of being able to explain decisions or actions, and we'll go into that. And second, the ability to take responsibility for them. Now, if we go into further depth and apply this idea to public policy, it's basically a matter of political representatives explaining their actions to their constituencies. And so accountability involves a process of formation, a common understanding of what needs to be reported and the consequences for the actions. With this definition, we've been working with colleagues in Ethiopia on two cases, and we've been using the accountability definitions found in the legislative branch, both in Latin America and in Ethiopia. So we're going to be talking about the mechanisms that we read in the literature and use and know as answerability within the executive. These are the mechanisms that Calamar suggests, and contemplate aspects which have to do with explaining the whys and wherefores of certain policy. Now, we're not going to be concentrating on the other part, which is the enforcement. We will leave this for a second conversation that we'll have with you later on. So here we can compare the experiences in Argentina and Kenya. There are some clear similarities, although the practice is very different in each case. Basically, in both countries, there are groups of mechanisms, one very much focused on accountability and responsibility on the part of the president or the person who answers to Congress. In Argentina, basically it's a matter geared to explaining government action, but also for proposing the agenda for policies for the legislators in the National Congress. In Argentina, this is on the 1st of March every year there's an address to the nation, and in Kenya also this happens when there's a new parliament opened. So it's a specific address once a year, and in terms of its content, it provides information about the policies adopted and the progress made in them for implementing them nationally. So and there's a similarity between these mechanisms from the point of view that the president or prime minister in other countries. It's important to mention that in Argentina and Kenya, we share a tradition of special parliamentary sittings. And of course, there's also the State of the Nation address, which goes back. It's traditional. It's important also to mention the context, which is often similar. There's a second group of mechanisms where we see similarities, and that's in the reports made to the legislative branch by ministers. In Argentina, this takes the form of monthly reports that the cabinet ministers must give to Congress in both houses of parliament. But they're also, but they can also have to make addresses on particular occasions when asked to. In Kenya, there's also the executive can also provide information on progress made in fulfilling international obligations of the Republic. So these two mechanisms can be seen in other countries. Now we're going to present very briefly some qualitative data focusing mainly on Argentina, and further on we will talk with Herman and Trufena. So very briefly, we're going to talk about the presidential addresses on accountability. We've been able to analyze in depth the presidential addresses from 1996 to date, and we've systematized the information, and we can share with you our findings. And we've been monitoring these subjects. The first thing about these presidential addresses is that they mainly focus on products, and then also, secondly, results. So the president can talk much more about service delivery and not so much the long-term effect that the policies have on the country. So here you have in the graph on the left, you can see very few indicators in the presidential speeches which measure the impact on the population. Who are the holders of rights for public policies? And there's very little communication about long-term effect. The president's focus or the prime minister's focus much more on products and results. And then there's a continuity. There are indicators reported by policy area. You can see here, and apart from the political orientation of each president, the political address focuses on certain core issues regarding accountability, in terms of the economics, education, sciences, and social sciences. In this sense, the addresses every year convey very similar concerns, politically, mainly the macro concerns of the presidents, and there are other aspects that we should mention. The speeches are very different depending on the presidents. Some are very brief, about an hour long, and others are very long. They can last 4 hours of accountability. And there are some specific findings. We've seen that in Kenya, like Argentina, the president's speech to parliament, or Congress as we call it here, is rather ceremonial and characterized with a very high level of respect and protocol. So we could call it a rite or ritual that occurs every year and has a number of very similar standards of conduct, which are very oriented again to protocol. And another thing that we can share is that the presidential address in this case, referring to the State of the Nation address, is weak. They focus on the process. They don't offer really clear evidence about the benefits or the impact that public policy have had on the community in general. In general, what we can see is that this weakness is due to not having sufficiently developed data that to be shared or that can underwrite this evidence. And another point is the amount of data presented in the reports, which seems to be related to the time the president has in office. This shows us that with more experienced presidents, they tend to give a bit more complex and rich information. Fourth, what we can see is that the speeches are discussed following the presidential address, above all in the media, where there is greater scope for accountability. But the discussion is very influenced by politics at the time, rather than the issues of the government plan or the development plans for public policy. And finally, what we see, and going back to an earlier point, it's in neither case, in Argentina or Kenya, is there an clear evidence of follow-up on the discussions carried out. This means that basically when the president's address is over, the discussion is over as well. There are no further discussions about the points made. As we said earlier, there's a second element or group of mechanisms that we want to share with you, and these are the reports by the executive to the legislative branch. These aren't given at a particular time, they're more routine. In Argentina, we've gone in depth into the reports of the chiefs of the cabinet to the nation, and traditionally, since 1995, when the post of chief of cabinet came into being, the amount of visits, compulsory visits that the chief had to make to the Congress are very few. only 36% of these presentations were made, of those that should have been made. And this goes back to the original point we made, the gap between the accountability design and practice. What we've seen, if we do a quantitative analysis of the data, is that during the elections years, they give far less info. There are far few reports made than in non-electoral years, certainly because of political reasons. There's less parliamentary discussion, and people are more interested in addressing the community outside Parliament. So some initial findings. There's something that concerns us about the compliance with the public mandate. Since the creation of the figure of the Chief of Cabinet, only 35% of the reports that should have been made to Congress have been made, so this is a very low level. The second issue is the incentive for attendance in elections years when it drops to 20%. We've also found in our analysis that although the law states that the Chief of Cabinet should alternate visits between the chambers or houses every other month, this hasn't happened always. There seems to be a slight preference for reporting in the Senate, and this is related to the difference between the rules for presenting reports between the two houses. Andrés will probably make comments about his experience on this. To close this section, we can start with Andrés' experience. We would like to tell you about some lessons learned. First of all, we understand that the deficits that we can see between the law and the practice of the mechanisms, there seems to be related to an absence or a weakness in the culture of accountability, and also with the lack of sanctions in case of non-compliance. Our constitution has a weakness because it doesn't issue sanctions in case of failure to comply with the mechanism. Second, in the case of the presidential addresses, and specifically the executive reports, what we can see is that the actions intended by a government for a particular period give an account of the actions that have been undertaken, but nevertheless, as these presentations are not structured around an overall government or a roadmap for the government, they just are reduced mainly to the capacity for dialogue between the powers or branches, because there's no discussion about policy, not so much of analysis of the government plan. Finally, how these mechanisms could be strengthened. Well, this could be done by establishing new, stronger sets of rules to offer better incentives to comply with the Constitution's mandate, but also to answer to society using a better, more reliable and valuable information. Finally, there are three extra points. First of all, what we see is that in modern democracies, we must constantly reflect on their practices to guarantee more transparency and good governance. We also see that there is a general perception, above all of the chiefs of cabinets and MPs, that we were able to speak to, related to much more, or rather that depends much more on the accountability of the ministries or other people or places that should provide information. As this isn't a general practice, and so here we understand that this arbitrariness is what must be avoided, and what is needed are strong regulations. That is, this is the only way that it would be possible to achieve improved function of existing mechanisms that are probably not best used at the moment. So, thus far, our presentation of our work, and now we'd like to talk a little bit with Andrés on the basis of his experience in the executive and the legislative branch. And he can tell us a little bit about how this figure of chief of cabinet works and the relationship between the legislative and the executive branches, and what his experience is with non-compliance with this mandate, and how his views have altered from when he was having to present reports and when he's been asking for them. And that is what he can tell us about this morning. So I will hand him the microphone. He can take the floor for him to tell us about his experience.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank CIPPEC and Natalia for the invitation to participate here. I would like to briefly share with you a brief introduction for you to have an outline about me. Okay, just as I was introduced by Natalia in a very accurate way, I have a bachelor's degree in public science, and for almost 10 years I worked as a subsecretary, a member of the the office of the chief of cabinet in Argentina, and also I was also in charge of the public ministry to find out the functions of the ministry. My areas were quite similar to those of human resources manager, but at a national level, or almost implying almost all of the executive. Okay, now having given you this small introduction, and that I hope myself that I hope we can go further in depth. Okay, with share of ideas and questions. I would like to structure. I would like to structure my my talk with you, just following what Natalia's alignment or line of thoughts in first lines. First, a small explanation of the Argentinian institutional engineering and why it happens at the institutional level, in particular, in the way it is ruled right now. The second part, I would like to share with you briefly what was my experience in the accountability or answerability process and with the chief of cabinet before the National Congress. And the third point would be I would like to share with you some reflections, even personal reflections, and some of my observations with regard to that process. What the first thing, okay, just in order to provide you a brief history as to how the cabinet office was formed in Argentina, I would like to tell you that in Argentina, obviously, its establishment as a national state, and with the establishment of its first constitution, that became quite stable, was in 1843, and that was during a presidential regime. And in that sense, it went so until the constitutional reform in 1944, that because caused by a political conflict that that had taken place, and there was an impossibility for a president to be elected, Carlos Menem in 1998 sets out the need to amend the constitution and to look for the possibility of a presidential re-election. Now, putting this in very simple terms, the political agreement that we came to was to establish the presidential rehabilitation and make for a president possible to be re-elected, and as a result of this, some limitations to the existing presidential power were established. This limitation is established based on two institutional instruments. The first one is the possibility of limitation to the president's legislative powers. You may know that most presidential regimes give authority, whether in greater or lesser extent, to the incumbents of the legislative to have the legislative instruments that allow them to advance with powers on the Congress. So what the 1994 amendment establishes is that some scopes of the where the president's power were no longer to be used by him. that is kind of powers, legislative powers, exceptional legislative powers. And first, the president would not be able to issue any legislatives that would amend criminal law reforms, and also he would no longer be able to produce laws by decrees by the legislation of political parties. And this is the this is the restrictions, from the criminal point of view and from the constituency, and on taxing also. The president is also no longer allowed to create any laws or issue any laws that have to do on taxation. And now a new set of regulations has to be set out as to in which cases the president is going to be able to produce, to issue these laws based on need and urgency, these unilateral laws. The second aspect that in which a president is allowed the re-election is through the establishment of the cabinet. The chief of cabinet, according to the constitution, has his functions established, but the spirit of the law was to create a kind of situation that made a counterweight to the president, in the sense of emulating the French government in 1958, where a semi-presidential aspect was established. So that we've got the chief of state, who is the president, but ruling the government, and it falls on a member of the Congress. It's following the French model. And the theoretical scholars say that this tends to be a more presidential model. But when a president is elected by the Congress, this follows another political color. So we're talking here between a coexistence between the president, which plays a more protocolar function, and the chief of government, the head of government, is the prime minister. It's actually the prime minister. So that is the spirit or the main influence that the policymakers had when they wrote the Argentinian constitution for the purposes of limiting or restricting the power of the president and making re-election possible. So what are the most relevant tasks that are established by the Constitution to the Chief of Cabinet? Number one is to coordinate the cabinet. He calls to the cabinet meetings and prepares their taking place. But in my understanding, the most important task is when the constituency was strictly thinking in the restrictions to the figure of the president. That means that they are mostly entrusted the administrative management of the country. So from that competence, the head of cabinet will co-rule or co-govern with the president of the nation. At the same time, for Argentina to carry on being a presidential regime, two functions are established in the relationship with the Congress. Number one is the mandatory status to be held accountable to the Congress every month about the government's actions. And on the other hand, the most important innovation is in the Argentinian institutional design is the possibility that simple majorities from both chambers, that means the deputies chamber and the Senate chamber, is that the chief of cabinet is removed from his position. So this is the framework, the institutional framework in which the head of cabinet works. And let me just make a comment here that I think it's fundamental. This institutional design has an Achilles heel. This Achilles heel is that the fact that this cabinet is still being appointed just by the president alone. This has generated in the recent history, because this has been developed in the last 20 years. This has brought about that the chief of cabinets in the practice have the same competences or the same power, the same institutional power, and also actual power that any other minister. That is that the chief of cabinet is still reporting to the president. If the president can remove him automatically through a unilateral measure, that doesn't need to be, and this measure that does not need to be ratified by any other element. So the possibilities for anyone to be appointed the chief of cabinet that actually exerts administration are very limited. And this does not mean that in the constitutional history of Argentina there have not been very powerful chiefs of cabinet. They could never exert an actual administrative power over the executive, but they could always do it with regard to the previous president. So this has always been the appointment of the chief of cabinet has always been the president's prerogative, and when chief of cabinets were able to exert their functions in a more autonomous way, that was because it was convenient to the wishes or the objectives, the political objectives or wishes of the president. Okay. In this context, now landing on the accountability process and telling you a bit about my experience in the cabinet in the last years, I think it's important to first give you this introduction. how, okay, going now to the second part of my lecture here. How does the accountability process works here? And I would also like to go a little bit more in depth in the aspects that Natalia has already mentioned with regard to the few times when the chiefs of cabinet concur with the Congress. The first place where the Constitution says that the president should concur every month, should report every month to any of the chambers to introduce or submit his accountability and to report the policymakers, the lawmakers, about the political status of the executive. Okay, notwithstanding this, okay, Constitution does not accurately define what is defined by every month, because there are months during the year when the Congress does not work. In Argentina, as Natalia said, the ordinary or regular sessions for the constitutional period when the Congress is open goes from the first year in every year when the president officially opens the Congress and gives his speech, okay, to the nation, and that regular period goes continues until the first days of December. So from the 10 years, from this 10-month period, there are at least 2 months or 2.5 months, months in which the Congress people say, okay, we can't attend the Congress because the Congress is closed. So another thing that is important here is, okay, I have already said okay, and from the starting point that there are 2 months or 3 months that the Congress during the year does not work. Okay, there you have an institutional problem. So there is and no one has the responsibilities of the chief of cabinet. So no one can prepare the reports during that period of time. Okay, because the system is not designed for a 12-year period. And this affects the accountability process because, and now I'm going to describe the process, because the accountability process itself, because of this, is very messy, and they cannot cover the whole process of the whole year. Am I speaking too fast? Okay, I was just sharing with Natalia and Sofia and Agustina. Okay, because if I am just going too fast, because I know that there's a translator and Natalia understands this well, because we do have a mix of Italian styled Spanish, so we tend to speak. Okay, we tend to speak a lot and very fast. So having said this, the process starts when the chief of cabinet says, okay, I want to go to the Congress, and the Congress has no possibilities to, especially when over these last 20 years, when most of the legislative were concurring with the president. So the executive had a majority in both chambers. Notwithstanding those times when the executive did not have the majority in both chambers or in any of the 2 chambers, there was no institutional culture for the president to be demanded in an actual way, okay, to prevent the formality of a public statement. and a way to make the chief of cabinet concur to come to the cabinet. So the accountability process starts when the chief of cabinet states that he wants the accountability process to get started, not before that. So the Congress does not have an enforcement capacity to set into motion that mandate. So why do the presidents? Why do the chiefs of cabinet want to come to the Congress? Okay, that is an open question that has no answer. Does not have any simple answers. I can just tell you, okay, based on my experience, what would be the reasons why a chief of cabinet will never come to the Congress. The first one is because there is not one single president that would ask his chief of cabinet to come to the Congress. So there is a implicit agreement there. Second one, we don't have a society that demands from the chief of cabinet, except for some isolated stakeholders, and that would be the groups of experts or scholars, academia. No, there is no social demand, okay, for the chief of cabinet to come to the Congress. The third point, and this is the one that I would like to go in further depth later on, because that states why the chief of cabinet do not go to the Congress to start an accountability process. It's because the accountability process is of no use to the Congress, no use to the chief of cabinet. So it's a game where there is no win-win situation for either of them, and from a political point of view. Okay, when the chief of cabinet makes up his mind and to go to the Congress, and he announces that he's coming to the Senate, that represents the provinces, both the senators and the deputies, as applicable, they start to issue a number of questions that will be the basis for the chief of cabinet's report. So what are the characteristics of these questions? So number one, the questions are illimited. So there's no regulation that limits, or no regulations from the Congress, or no general regulations that establish a limit in the number of questions that should be asked to the chief of cabinet. The second point, and I think that makes this process even messier, is that the chief of cabinet needs to answer in advance to each one of these questions. So just to give you an example, I remember when my political chief, he was the chief of cabinet and I was part of his team. This was Juan Medina. And so the first accountability process at the Senate, I remember that there was a meeting held by his closest staff to manage the almost 1,500 questions that he had to answer in a 15-day period. So there were direct advisors, subsecretaries, secretaries. They had to request all of the ministers and also to those in charge of the main government agencies to devote part of their time to answer these 1,500 questions in a 15-day period. That, for me, was the first reason. Well, this is very messy. We were very reluctant to do this, not only because it took away time from our normal activities during the day, and these questions demanded a lot of time from us. But just to give you an idea, a head of cabinet in Argentina is a person who works around between 14 and 16 hours a day at a minimum outside his home. So this also applies to the other ministers, the secretaries and the subsecretaries. The pace of the work demands at least 10 to 12 hours a day of their work. Okay, but it's okay. They also have to devote some of that time to their political activities, but it's also work. So this is a very important task to be carried out, at least in Argentina. In fact, there is a Parliament Relations Secretariat that is in charge of administering all of this process. Because the execution of the process, that means answering all of these questions. Just imagine, if there are between 1,500 to 2,000 questions, there are some very specific questions that the Cabinet's office, that no matter how efficient the monitoring and accountability process in a country is set in place, it's impossible to answer all of these questions. So first, there is a selection process for these questions, where these questions are referred to the public organizations that have the information and the competence to answer these questions. The second step would be to analyze the quality of the questions, to see if these questions actually address to specific things that need to be answered. And of course, the political information also that is going to be provided to these answers need to be also checked, because this is public information, and this could also provide a higher level of knowledge. And so it needs to be established as to because what information is going to be provided, because it's going to the whole of the citizens in the country.
When there are questions, the legislators were aware of this situation, and this was obviously a very awkward system. When there was a half-hour presentation to be made, then the legislators would raise the same questions again, and I can't do this. And so they would ask the same questions again, and some of the political parties would get together and do that, and they would just interrupt each other, asking questions, and this wasn't for accountability, because the office chief could decide what questions to answer and which he wouldn't, because there wasn't enough time. So he might answer 50-odd questions in 20 minutes, and also because he chose the least complicated questions to answer. So in conclusion, I think in my perception of the process is that there's a factory fault in the system. The amount of times the chief of the cabinet has to go to Parliament, and also the number of questions from senators and deputies. If they're going to ask that many questions, they're going to get very low quality answers. And in my opinion, the process should move to a more oral system, not be a written system. The amendments we want to make or what we tried to do when we dealt with deputies and senators, was that we tried to get them to ask fewer questions. Because they made it quite impossible for the questioners. What we wanted them to do was try and make them ask questions in a more rational way. We gave them a format, a model, for them to ask in English or Spanish, so that when the chief of the cabinet went to the chamber of the House to answer on specific issues, he would be accompanied by a minister, all the ministers of the relevant areas, and wouldn't answer all the questions corresponding to all the different competent authorities. And that was helpful in Argentina. We're living in societies where the public debate is carried out through the media, and this debate is conducted about policies, not accountability. Chief of cabinet obviously doesn't want to be accountable. Nobody does generally, but when there are tasks to be carried out which take a lot of time, legislators don't, because they don't want to stop being at the forefront of issues. If we think about our case, the main option for both actors, both the Congress and the executive, is to maintain this balance point that we are trying to reach now. And I think I will end there. I think we've got to be thinking about a process which could be televised. I think it's important for accountability, for strengthening democratic processes and the democratic institutions and society that should consume an accountability process in the terms that society consumes goods and services at the moment. If there is a system which is both, which is written and oral, and is as extensive as it is at the moment, is not going to be helped. So I would suggest that this to the discussion and leave this to the moderator now. Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrés. I think that was very interactive and a challenging, thought-provoking presentation. So now we will give the floor to Susana Vacuna from OSSREA.
My name is Trufena Mkuna from OSSREA. I'm going to talk about answerability in Kenya. And just as you have heard from Natalia about what goes on with the speech of the president on the state of the nation, it is in the Constitution of Kenya. It is a ceremony that is looked forward to, and people have a lot of expectations that they usually send to State House through the media. In most cases, he comes to talk to Parliament about the economic and social and political development that the country has achieved. He also highlights the challenges that the country has at the moment, and especially the pertinent issues affecting accountability. For example, in the last the last State of the Nation address, the president was talking about the cabinet ministers who had been sacked. And this was because this was a very hot issue in the government at that time. It was important that they talk about it in Parliament and Senate, because the two houses come together to listen to the president when he's giving the State of the Nation. Generally, he talks about the State of the Nation. In this particular case, he deviated and was speaking about the achievements his government has made. And in Kenya, this did not go down well, especially with the opposition party. We also see, just like in Argentina, we do not have a follow-up mechanism on the State of the Nation. Oh, sorry, I was talking too fast. Now I am, let me slow down. We have also seen, just like in Argentina, we do not have a follow-up mechanism in what happens or what the president speaks in his address of the nation. In as much as this is provided for in our Kenyan constitution, no one has picked it up to follow up. Now, the members of the opposition party, the ones who talk about it immediately after the president's speech, just giving media their feelings, but we haven't seen that being taken up and maybe going forward to make the president make amendments or maybe give another statement in as a follow-up of what he has already presented. There is need for inter-party dialogue so that it tones down this majoritarian electoral system, because in the Kenyan politics we find that there is a lot of heckling from the opposition party of what the president is presenting. They are always, it ends up being more of a witch hunting of what they haven't done than what has been achieved, and the forecasting or the strategy of where the government is headed. I would like to also say something about kleptocracy that has been pointed out here. There are just a few individuals in the government who propagate corruption. It's not everybody, or governance in Kenya is not dependent on kleptocracy. That would be misleading. We can say there are just a few individuals and they are brought to book. What happens is, with the new constitution, the president, the Parliamentary Accounts Committee calls the cabinet secretaries to come and answer questions and give reports about their performance. Now, during that time, if there is an issue in a particular sector, or the cabinet secretary presents something that is not true according to their reports, they are questioned. It is followed up and taken to, if somebody is guilty of corruption or any malpractice, then it is forwarded to the Anti-Corruption Commission, which takes it up and works together with the public prosecutor. And therefore, the issues of corruption are in a few individuals. It's not the whole government that is corrupt as such. The Parliamentary Accounts Committee is doing its work very well. The head of civil service advises the president, and the president also has other advisors from different sectors of the economy, and also the ministers who tell him what he should do. I think that is all. But if there is any clarification you would like to get from me, I will gladly repeat.
Thank you, Jovena. That's been a great help for us to understand what's happening in Kenya and be able to compare the situation with Argentina. And to close, then perhaps we can we can answer some questions that have been made. So I'll ask Sophia to briefly comment on the main issues that have been raised during the conversation so that we can answer them. Thank you, Natalia. We've received a lot of questions from the audience and a lot of comments as well, so many thanks for your participation. And some of the questions and comments are related to the mechanisms for the State of the Nation address in Kenya and Argentina, and others regarding the Chief of the Cabinet, and a few others that we can discuss. Well, the State of the Nation address, one of the first questions made is who decides the issues that the President will deal with. And the person who asked the question felt that the issues discussed are really intended to make the President look good and not generate discussion about public policy. At the moment, Ravena, our friends from OSSREA can talk about have mentioned that the advisors of the President decide on the issues to be presented. These addresses have a political role. This also happens in Rwanda. It's interesting to hear a bit more about Africa. Another question is how the presidential addresses improve accountability, and if there are mechanisms for issues in Parliament to be there are ways which Parliament or the executive can, if Parliament can make sure the executive is more accountable. As Trofena said in her presentation, there are no mechanisms for following up the addresses, and this is a very important aspect. These mechanisms must be strengthened. Going on to the Chiefs of Cabinet, there have been some questions presented about the appointment of people to this office. Is this done just by the President? And what happens if these people are not competent and the President doesn't want to change the situation? So the question is if this makes accountability, affects accountability. Another point made with regard to the Chief of the Cabinet, whether the question and answers over the reports have any real impact on the accountability of government. Another comment made is that despite the fact that it would seem that the Kenyan president has more channels for responding to the community and citizens than in Argentina, nevertheless, in Kenya, there isn't such good performance as in Argentina, and we'd like to understand this. And another comment is that earlier Kenyan governments have done a lot of work, have made great efforts to pass strict laws focused on encouraging strong civil society, or is this less so than in Argentina? Those are the comments and the questions. Thank you very much for your participation. And now I will pass the floor to Natalia.
Okay, thank you, Sophia. And all the comments are open, but we can also see the difficulty of the introduction about the mechanisms, and it also comes from other spheres, like the parliamentary level, that has made difficult for the adaptation or rethinking the mechanism for accountability process in Argentina, and that has caused that our political culture has not become solid or sound, and that the accountability process has not become more sound. Okay, over 20 years of its implementation. Before we close our webinar, would like Andrés to come up with a final comment, no more than 2 minutes, so that we can go to our colleagues in Africa if they want to add anything else, and if not, that would be, we would just say goodbye. Okay, Andrés. Okay, just one last reflection about the question that was made. I think that the challenge that the democratic institutions are being faced with now is to be adapted to the society that the societies they have to rule or govern. I would like to give an example about this, about accountability. And I was thinking when I was on my way here about this. The president of Argentina 2 days ago about an energetic crisis that we're being faced with here. He recommended the citizens to just warm up a little bit more when they are at home, so that they consume less heating. Okay, so they have so on Twitter, pictures were shown of the president. Okay, living inside the government palace. Okay, without wearing any warming up clothes, so that implied that he was actually using the heating service. So if the government are unable to account for and to societies about the processes that they are asking the societies to get into, so the accountability process needs to become more democratic, more plural, and in that sense, legislation has to be made so that the presidents are being held accountable to all society. Because if they fail to do this, okay, they are not going to be held accountable by anybody. That would be my conclusion. Thank you, Andrés. So now I would like to give the floor to Herman Musahara for his conclusions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Natalia and the rest. Mine was from the African side. Hear me? Can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me? So I wanted, if you're hearing me, okay, thank you. I wanted to say from this side that this was a very detailed, very good presentation, Natalia and the rest, Sophia and the Honorable Andrés. And my view was that I hope we didn't have time, but to also get the value of the comparative study. And I think given the comments from the general participants, I think they really need to have lessons from Argentina, or Africa to Kenya is very vivid. And my general comment is actually that when we are using state of the nation address in the two cases, we are well aware that these are just on and off events on a single day on a calendar. But there is a big forest of all those mechanisms we talked about. So I think this has been, it has to be looked on a broader basis, and I think where we start from is both common, there are gaps in the horizontal accountability in the two sides, but the difference is that I think some people like Alois was asking, is that the degree of the difference can also is providing the lessons that are required. And I think the second thing that I think we shall follow is that while, for example, in many parts of Africa, there is a very big zeal to follow up the financial accountability, the audit, and to be clean audit under the Parliamentary Audit Committee. I think the webinar and the lectures from this one indicates that it is more than having finance clear. It's more also on having list issues of following up how sanctions can be meted out, and I think maybe that will be coming on enforceability. But I think the answerability is also a bigger process, and I wanted just to say I admire this and thank you.
Muchas gracias, Germán. La verdad es que coincidimos y creo que ha sido un intercambio muy fructífero. Y creo también, o creemos desde aquí desde CIPPEC, como señala Emmanuel en nuestra...
As just pointed out in our private conversation that this is a widespread need, and we need people like or control organizations, the Bank of Reserve, to come to a common arena so that we can come to a global or comprehensive accountability. From our side, we would like to share with you that we are online available for you through this webinar. We want to thank you a lot for your participation and your patience. To Daniel Chigudu, to Aloisio, to Emmanuel, to Carla Dongo, and to Andrea Bacineri for their technical support, and also to all the other colleagues from OSSREA, people from Ethiopia, and the program, and the people from the ELA program and the practical actions in Peru, and also to the technical team in CIPPEC, and to Agustina and all the people present here, and to Andrés for sharing his experience as a public servant with us. And it's been a pleasure for us, and we hope to have another meeting like this one in the near future. Thank you very much. Goodbye.